Whether you're hyperconnecting your ecosystem, empowering a distributed workforce, rapidly leveraging cloud, IoT, AI, or other new technologies, RSA is here to help you manage digital risk your way at every stage of your journey.
Hello, and welcome to Protecting Privacy in the Cloud, Key Considerations and How to Implement. If you're joining us live, our speaker will be answering questions in the post-session discussion forum immediately following the presentation. The forum link is available in the networking lounge. For audio-video issues, you can click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Michelle Smith for the presentation.
Hello. I'm Michelle Smith. I've been a product manager in the data protection and privacy team at Google for the last 5 years. I work in Google Cloud, and I lead a team of product managers focused on all types of issues related to data sovereignty, access, insider risk in Google Cloud. And I am so excited to be here to talk to you about one of the topics I'm very passionate about, which is privacy. Now, when I think about privacy, specifically on the business side, because I've also looked at privacy on the consumer side, there's kind of three major categories that come up. Being that I started with privacy on the consumer side, when I first started to look at privacy from a business perspective, I thought that there would be a lot of issues around compliance and user privacy, which we see here. But actually, the main thing that customers wanted to talk about was really about data access and sovereignty. The questions that I would get, as you can see for an example here, really try to get to the heart of, will my data remain confidential in your platform? Right? And that's why you see questions here like customer managed encryption keys. If I have a service that uses it and I transfer my data to a service that doesn't support it, does my data become decrypted? Does someone have access to it? And will that data be able to be given to the US government? So that's one of the first framings that came up quite often. The second framing that came up is one of the ones I was expecting, which is adherence to local regulations and certain compliance frameworks, which in general, which is not specific to privacy, really is a table stake for any corporation, that you meet certain regulations and that you comply with certain compliance frameworks. And so when it comes to privacy laws and standards, there's no difference. They are table stake standards and legislation that they have to adhere to. And then finally, when it comes to user privacy, this is the area that really aligned with what I was doing on the consumer privacy, where you start to come up with issues such as notice and consent, really about data collection and the purpose for which you're going to use that data. And for business customers, this is really around, does the cloud provider have access to my end user data? And if they do, how do they use it? What about my employee data, right? Because employees are individuals as well. They're people that there's personal data about them. How will that data be used? So those are the three main things that would come up as we would talk to customers. And now I want to talk a little bit about the challenges associated with each of those frameworks. So when it comes to data access and sovereignty, it's really about visibility into the operations of the cloud provider, right? When you think about it, if you are a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer at a corporation, you know what security operations you have in place, you know what you've set up, and you know what you've done to protect data from unauthorized use. When you move to a cloud provider, you're wondering, do they have the same physical securities that I would have in my data center or my on-premise data center? Do they have the same operations in place? Do they require similar types of authorizations before a support personnel or an engineer can access data? Right? And so that's one challenge that comes up. The other thing is, since I have that control over my employees when they access data, what does the cloud provider put in place? Is there some type of multi-party authorization, or can the customer support person just access the data? And if they want to access the data, do they have to ask me before they access it? Or if they just have a ticket, can they just go and do it? And similar, like with engineers, if they're troubleshooting an outage, do they have to come to me before they access my data? Or do they have permission to just go and do it? A lot of questions come up around that. And then final questions came up really was around, especially especially outside the US, was around the surveillance posture of the country that the cloud provider operates in. In my case, because I'm with Google, we operate in the United States. And so there's a lot of questions about how do we provide data from our customers to the US in the case of some type of legal request. And so that's really what you see on the right side, like that first tier of sovereignty called data sovereignty. And data sovereignty is really about data access. And if you see, there's a whole spectrum when it comes to the larger question around sovereignty, where while data sovereignty focuses specifically on access to data, you start to go into operational sovereignty, which starts to look at who can access the data, right? And then you start to go into software sovereignty, which is really about how do I ensure that if I couldn't get any updates from my cloud provider, that I know I can survive and my workloads can continue to run. So there's a big range around data sovereignty or digital sovereignty, and data sovereignty comes up a lot in the context of privacy. I mentioned before privacy compliance. Some of the challenges there really align with the proliferation of different compliance frameworks. And as I'm looking here, I've named a few in my kind of word puzzle there on the right. And as I'm looking at it now, I see that I've already left out one of the newer ones, the ISO 27701 standards, which tries to certify cloud providers as a controller versus a processor, which is terminology that was made pretty popular when GDPR was signed into law back in 2018. As you can tell, customers are really struggling with how do I, if I do CCPA, does that conflict at all with GDPR? And if I do ISO 27552 or ISO 27701, will that just cover all of these different regulations, privacy regulations that I'm concerned about, right? And then in addition to that, from a compliance perspective, how do I evidence on top of a cloud? If you think about some of these compliance standards, a lot of them were created and focused a lot on the on-premise scenario, right? They didn't necessarily take into consideration the shared responsibility between the cloud provider and the customer. And so when you're trying to evidence on top of the cloud, you'll see a lot of people doing things like taking screenshots of configurations, which is maybe not the most efficient way to do it, but it's something that gives them something that's somewhat immutable, that has a specific point in time that they can use to evidence. So these are some of the challenges that I've seen as I talk to our different customers around privacy in the cloud. User privacy, which goes back to that kind of consumer, aligns a lot more with that consumer privacy angle, really focuses on things like consent and terms. And so when you think about in the individual world where you're going and starting an app on your phone, you may see a pop-up that says, do you want to share your location information, right? Now on the business side, you can imagine that maybe Google or maybe a cloud provider knows about where the location is of your employee who's accessing their console, right? And so questions come up about, how does my employee consent to share that type of data with Google? Is that part of the privacy policy that Google provides? Is that part of the terms and service or the contract that we have, right? How does that happen? Right. And so a lot of questions come up around the terms. The other question comes up is related to a new trend that I'll talk about later as well, which is to give people recommendations on how to use cloud more efficiently. And this is typically based on metadata that the cloud provider knows about you. So let's say, for example, if you're using an online storage solution and you put a file into that storage solution, it's clear that that file is your data. But if we know, let's say the online cloud provider knows that the size of that file is 2 gigabytes, right? And they need to know that so that they can charge you. The fact that they know that the file is 2 gigabytes, is that your data? Is that their data? And furthermore, can I then use that data to run it through either machine learning algorithms or rule-based algorithms to help you figure out how to store, how to, leverage our storage better, or to how to store it more securely, right? So all of these things which can really help you still brings up questions around, like, is this information about you? Is this information that you own or someone else's, or the cloud provider owns? And how can it be used, right? Which are really core principles around data privacy. So the market has evolved to try to address these challenges. And I would say, from what I've observed, and this is an area that, when you join the Networking Lounge later, would love to discuss with you. I see that a lot of the current spend in the market is really happening in this third column that I have up here, reporting and compliance. And I think the reason why that's happening is really because a lot of what customers are hiring people for is consultation. Like I said before, it's really difficult to keep up with the proliferation of frameworks and laws and regulations that are out there. So they're hiring consultants to help them understand how to interpret, how do I change my technology or my operations to now align with these new laws or these new standards? How do I evidence on top of it so that I can prove to regulators and whoever else that is like a third-party auditor and to my customers that I'm actually doing this correctly? And then how do I prove that my sub-processor, who is the cloud provider, is also doing things correctly? And so a lot of consultants are being leveraged, in their proprietary tools that comes along with their services are being leveraged to really address that that issue that customers are having right now. But we see a lot of technology advances happening in the first two columns. So if you take a look at the first one with data governance, you'll see that I've broken that out into kind of three areas: data asset management, automated classifiers, and finally policy enforcement, which is all brought together to really create an end-to-end data governance scenario. And then the middle column starts to focus on, how do I make sure that I can get the most out of the data while still preserving the privacy of the data, making sure that identifiable information in the data can't be released or given. And so the next couple of slides is going to talk about each of these areas and how the market is trying to help people in all three columns. So let's start with data governance. And when you think about data governance, or at least when I do, I think about two primary personas, and that's like the DevOps or the IT admins who are setting up the different environments for which the workloads would run, as well as the risk compliance officers who have to evaluate that environment to make sure that it complies with the rules that have been set up, right? And some of the things that we're seeing is inventory systems. I think almost every major hyperscaler has some kind of inventory system where you can see all the resources that you've created for a particular project or a particular organization, right? And people are leveraging those inventory systems to understand, like, where is data flowing in my system, and create data maps. They're leveraging it to create data deletion and data retention policies, right? So that's a big trend that I'm starting to see in that area. Definitely auto classification, the ability to just scan data, especially at collection time, right? That's probably one of the easiest times to figure out what your data is. What we're seeing a lot of people use consultants for is to actually go back and scan their environments, because they're like, I'm not sure what data is in here, help me, right? And so the more you can start to do that data classification at the time when you collect the data, the easier it will make for you later on. And then another thing that's come up is this policy as code. Policy as code is really interesting because it basically changes policy enforcement into a change management problem, which is something that many IT operators and engineers are familiar with, right? Because they check in source code all the time, and they do version checking, and they do pre-checks to make sure that the code is right before it goes up to production, right? And so if you think about policy as code, how can I codify my policy similar to the way I do code, so that I can actually preview the changes that it will do to production before it happens, that I can make sure I understand what the actual policies are, and that I can do some type of automated enforcement around it. So those are the things that I'm seeing in the data governance area. When it comes to data protection, obviously encryption is a big area. A lot more happening around not just encryption at rest or in transit, but also with encryption in use. So with encryption at rest, obviously key management, KMS, we're seeing HSM scenarios. And even recently, we're starting to see scenarios where the customer can actually completely keep the key outside of the environment. And the key management service, KMS, knows how to interact with that external key and use it to encrypt the data. The other thing that we're starting to see with the kind of rise of confidential computing is that you can now have data encrypted in memory, which also starts to address a significant insider risk concern that some customers have. So that's one great way to protect the data. We see some customers using this as a way to control access to the data, where if you log in with a certain identity, then certain fields, let's say in a BigQuery table, are encrypted and you can't see it. You only get to see the ones that you really need, right? And so combined with granular level access that's being built into the storage systems and encryption, you can start to build together a really meaningful data protection state. The other thing that I'm seeing a lot of trends is in data de-identification and anonymization. And a lot of you may have heard of differential privacy, which attempts to add noise to data so that you can still get information from the data, but you won't be able to re-identify any of the people in the data, right? And so those types of techniques are starting to grow so that people can do things like share data. If you think about the healthcare industry, you, as a provider, you may really want to share some data. As a healthcare provider, you may want to share data with research so that you can get more insights and be able to take that information back and help your patients. And so sharing that data in a way that doesn't identify the patient, but allows them to do that research becomes really crucial. And so these trends in data de-identification and anonymization are really starting to grow. And then finally, we've talked a lot already about reporting and compliance, where the main thing that we're seeing happening there is really around the consultant services. But another thing that I want to talk about is recommenders. And I think different hyperscalers call them different things, like you'll hear a trusted advisor or recommenders. But really what the idea is that they're using information, typically metadata, about how you use the platform to help you be more efficient in the cloud and more secure. So like, are you over permissioning your IAM permissions? Do you have IAM permissions that you've granted to a role and that never get used, right? And so those types of things are starting to happen a lot more across the different hyperscalers to help people stay in a secure place, to stay in a more efficient state, and actually really just to save money, right? Cost savings, because we know when we're working in cloud, one of the big things is trying to control that budget, right? And so this is an area, is a trend that I'm starting to see happen across a lot of cloud providers, as well as continuous monitoring of the compliance posture. And now this is typically, I think, started with some of the other frameworks like PCI for payment information and some of the other more standards like the CIS benchmark, but it's slowly starting to go into the privacy space. So I wouldn't be surprised if soon, if you see like, if you start to see CCPA monitoring available in different types of SOC tooling that has been provided by the cloud providers and typically used for things like threat detection, now being used to detect compliance failures. Those are things that are starting to come up quite a bit. And then privacy risk assessment services, another trend. I think like OneTrust, I think, is one of the best examples that I can think of here, where they can help you create the data protection impact assessment that you have to complete for the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, right? And so how do you have, so it's really about creating an assessment that helps you identify these are the highest privacy risk activities that I'm doing, data processing activities that I'm doing, and then put a plan around it to identify this is what the data is, this is the processing that's happening, and this is the way we're protecting it and ensuring that it doesn't get disclosed to any unauthorized person. So the market has changed to help people out with all of these privacy challenges. So what can you do so that you can help yourself do better at cloud privacy? One thing, definitely move towards data classification-centric privacy policies. This goes back to the things I was saying about policy as code. Once you have a really good data classification model, then you can start to say, when I have this type of data, or when my infrastructure sees this type of data, then I can automatically apply these policies. So having data classification-centric privacy policies will really help from that perspective. It will also help you understand, like, if you do live in a hybrid model where some of the data stays on premise and some of it goes to the cloud, you know, this classification of data is fine to go to the cloud, and then you can create proxies around it to make sure that as data leaves from your on-premise to the cloud, that it doesn't take any of that data that's not been approved and classified to go to the cloud. We talked about policy as code. I think the biggest thing for driving policy into the infrastructure really are two things. One is when you can get to that ability to preview the impact of the changes will be significant value to you. And then two, it's just really difficult to continue to manage policies as people have done today through spreadsheets and basically living as tribal knowledge. When you can start to get into the infrastructure, you can take the burden off people to enforce policy and really let the infrastructure do some of that heavy lifting for you. Data minimization through de-identification and anonymization. Once, like I said, again, you can minimize your risk, and you can actually kind of minimize the types of regulations you have to adhere to if you can anonymize the data, right? Because most of the privacy regulations really apply to personal data, and the data is anonymous, it is no longer personal, right? And then finally, start planning for the cloud provider audits and, you know, getting their access logs and how to migrate your processes, because what people really struggle with is they look at these compliance frameworks and these standards, and they're looking at it from a lens of being on-prem. And then when you go to the cloud, you're not really sure which part you're supposed to do and what part the cloud provider does. And so if you start looking at their audits, right, that they make available to you, and looking at how they do things, making sure that you can have oversight from them, from the access logs that you generate, as well as they should be able to provide you with access logs of their support personnel and their engineers, and just leverage that to really understand your full privacy posture on that cloud provider. The more you prepare for that earlier, the better. I would say immediately do that last thing I was just talking about, figuring out how to integrate the cloud provider audits into your processes and your standard compliance processes, assessing the frameworks that you care about in your organization today and see how suitable they are for like different types of cloud security models, whether you're building a cloud native application or doing a lift and shift into the cloud. And then I would say over the longer term, the more you can start to move your policies towards a data-centric, data-driven approach to scale your policies and to move it more into the infrastructure, I think that you'll find that you'll be able to monitor your privacy policies better, and that you will have more confidence as you go into your different audit cycles to show that you are truly doing the best that you can to protect the privacy of your users. Now, with that said, that's all I had for this talk. I would love to talk to you more. As a reminder, I'll be in the discussion forum that's available after this session to answer any questions. So if you hop on over to the networking lounge, you can connect with me live there.